Welcome to episode 74 of the Various and Sundry podcast. I'm your host, Matt Harmon, joined live from the Vault Studio on the beautiful campus of Grace College and Theological Seminary by my good friend, my colleague, my co-host, and the man who is now a seasoned four-wheeler rider, John Scott Sloat.
Doc, what's happening?
Well, we're recording on a Tuesday morning, and it's June 1st.
Yeah. By the way, can we talk about 74 real quick?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, how did we get here?
Well, I mean, I think we've talked about this in the origin story, but it is stunning that we are at 74 consecutive weeks of producing content.
Yeah. Wild.
We did not anticipate that. And I think, honestly, I think COVID made it happen.
Yeah, I think this is. I think we got to give credit where credit's due to the virus. Yeah.
Well, some people might think that's a bad thing, that it's COVID's fault that we now produce weekly content, but
well, they don't have to listen.
That's right. It's a free country. You know, this is also a free product.
Yeah.
So if you don't like it, you're not forced to listen.
It's not free. It costs you and me money.
Yeah, actually, that's true. This is a financially losing prospect for us.
Yeah, maybe in the future we start a Patreon where people can pay to get subscriber-only episodes.
There you
I
go.
don't know.
But that would mean producing more content.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sure we're ready for that. I'm not sure the world is ready for that.
No.
But in any case, it's good to be in the summer groove, little different vibe.
Yeah.
And
I'm in shorts. This is wonderful.
Yeah. I don't know what the dress code is around here during the summer because faculty technically aren't even under contract. And I stress the word technically.
Yeah.
But a little more casual vibe around the building here, and also nice maskless. You know, we've lifted the mask mandate here on campus, and so good to see that. And you also start to see some of the summer construction projects that take place, like they're redoing a room across the hall here, and my guess is they're supposed to redo the door on the vault. Did you know this?
Oh, no, I didn't.
That's the plan. So I actually took some pictures this morning because we're still going to call it the Vault Studio.
Yeah.
Even after they put a normal door on it. But
it's just going to be a regular –
I think so.
A regular wood door of some kind?
I guess.
Okay.
I guess. I mean, apparently the equipment in here is not valuable enough to maintain the vault door. So
interesting.
In any case, if you'd like to connect with the podcast, you can find us on Twitter at V&S You can email the show, variousandsundrypodcast@gmail.com. We do have a Facebook page. I'm not sure if John's able to monitor it anymore. Did you get into your –
Nope. Still haven't. Now, I will say I haven't tried really hard because I didn't like Facebook to begin with, and really the only reason I was still on there was for the VNS pod.
Okay.
So the fact that I got locked out and somebody stole my identity in some way on there, I'm just like, whatever.
Okay. I haven't gotten a new friend request from you, so I suppose that's a good sign, right? I mean, because oftentimes that can lead to spoofing accounts. And
Sure. I just wonder what they're going to do with me.
I don't know. And we also are on YouTube. You can find us, Various and Sundry Podcast on YouTube. And we would love for you to go ahead and leave us a glowing review and 5-star rating on whatever platform you access the show. One other bit of housekeeping before we dive into the world of sports. We wanted to remind you that we are reading through Jonathan Pennington's book, Jesus the Great Philosopher. That's our summer read, and we will have a link in the show notes for you to find that on Amazon, where you can purchase it. And starting next week, we will read and discuss the first 3 chapters of that book.
Yep.
And I'll just reiterate, even if you're someone who philosophy, I don't know if that's my jam. It's well written, it's accessible.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
There's tons of cultural references. It feels like a conversation that you're having with him. So, and we have locked him in for an interview.
Yeah.
So we will at the very end of our series of episodes that talk about this book, we will have a full-length episode where we interview Jonathan and talk about that book, but also some of the other things that he's written and interested in. So heads up on that one next week.
We need to ask him about theologians in cars getting coffee or whatever his YouTube show is.
Yes, we will do that. We will definitely do that. So on to the world of sports. It seems like NBA playoffs are kind of consuming most of the oxygen of the sports world. I know that there was where are we at in the NHL playoffs? Did they?
That's a great question.
I think there was a series that just ended.
I know Penguins Islanders just ended.
Okay, yeah,
but I
don't follow it, so I don't.
My family does. I'll get garbage from them for not following it. But
all right. So NBA playoffs. I think it's been a pretty good first round. Pretty interesting. This year feels so wide open. Lakers and Suns are tied at 2 games apiece. And now with Anthony Davis doubtful, I think, for Game 5 because of a groin injury, like that series is at the tipping point where the Suns could go ahead and continue to win that. It's a weird dynamic because the Suns are the 2, the Lakers are the 7.
But the favorite.
But the Lakers, if healthy, would be the favorite. Mm-hmm. So that's just the question there. The Jazz are now up 3-1 on the Grizzlies, despite my young son's prediction before Game 1 that the Grizzlies would win this series. He's having to backpedal a bit from that. And Clippers and Mavs tied at 2. That's a strange series. The home team has not won a game.
Interesting.
Mavs won the first 2 games in Los Angeles. Clippers have won the 2 games in Dallas. Let's see here. Nuggets and Blazers tied at 2. That's a really good series. The Bucks swept the Heat. Sixers lead the Wizards 3-1. Nets over the Celtics 3-1 at this point.
Did you see Kyrie Irving stomped on a leprechaun?
Yeah, and then got a water bottle thrown at him.
Yeah.
And I think I heard they're charging the guy that threw the water bottle at him with some sort of like felony assault.
Really?
Which feels a bit heavy to me. Like absolutely charge the guy with like some sort of crime. Like you need to deter that kind of idiotic behavior.
Yeah, I agree. You got to do something to the fans, but a felony?
But a felony seems a bit heavy-handed. My guess is that gets pled down to some sort of misdemeanor and 2,000 hours of community service and probation for a couple of years or something. But I'm glad that there's been a spike with fans returning to the arena of abuse directed towards players. Almost exclusively verbal abuse. But this was sort of the next step of like, this is getting serious. They need to do something about it.
And Russell Westbrook got a tub of popcorn thrown on him as he was leaving. Yeah. That feels pretty standard. And, like I remember seeing images of guys leaving the tunnel and just raining down. Now, the difference is he was injured coming off the floor. Pretty frustrated.
Totally classless.
And then Trae Young in the Garden got spit on.
Yes. And I think the NBA also is trying to crack down on some of the chants directed towards Trae Young as well. When you have the New York Knicks fans essentially chanting F Trae Young. That's apparently a little far beyond what the NBA is willing to.
I did not hear that one. I heard
and he's going bald.
That he's going bald. I thought that was fun.
Well, I think that was more of I think we're getting pushback for the F Trae Young chants, and so now it's we can just make fun of his hair. That seems within the boundaries of
Yeah, that sounds like fun to me.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your Knicks. They're down 3-1.
Yeah, I think I'm fearful they peaked a little early in the season. So when they were winning 8, 9, 10 games in a row, they were playing really well, really good basketball, and it feels like the book's out on them a little bit. That you gotta shut down Julius Randle and then just sort of slow down Derrick Rose. And if you do that, no one else can really score.
Right. And I think – and this is part of the difference between playoff basketball and regular season basketball. Mm-hmm. When you can lock in on a particular opponent and not – because in the regular season it's like you got – you're playing the Sixers one night and then the next night you're playing the Wizards. Mm-hmm. And, you're talking through different defensive adjustments and key players that you have to – but when it's the same team,
Yeah.
you can sort of figure the other team out a little bit more clearly. And it seems like the Hawks have kind of figured out the Knicks that they really can't score. That if Randall's not playing well, they're going to struggle to score. And if you're counting on a 47-year-old Derrick Rose, I know he's not 47, but he feels like that, to carry you, that's not a recipe for success in the playoffs.
Yeah, and R.J. Barrett's been really disappointing because it feels like he's the second option, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go to him to get 20, 25 points a game off of Randall, and he just has gone cold and seems to have shied away from that spotlight a little bit.
Well, besides Randall and Rose, it does feel like a young team.
Mm-hmm.
R.J. Barrett, Bullock,
yeah.
Quickly, like all those guys are young in
Yep.
the league, less than 3 years kind of thing, and all of them in the playoffs for the first time. So they're just figuring things out when it comes to what playoffs are like. But we'll see. It'll be interesting to see how that develops, and then of course we better check in with your beloved New York Mets.
Yeah, they're on a West Coast swing right now, so the games aren't starting till 9:45 at night.
Which is like 2 hours past your bedtime.
I stayed up to about 10:30 last night watching the game, but I just couldn't do it anymore. But they're getting healthy, so they no longer have guys who are hitless in their MLB career in the lineup.
Okay.
Yes. And so they're getting healthy. Their bats are waking up a little bit. And they're first place in the NL East, 2.5 games, 3 games, something like that. So,
But didn't Syndergaard just went on the DL, did he not?
yes. Well, he had been on the 60-day because he's coming off Tommy John surgery. And in a rehab assignment where he's supposed to go 4 innings, he only went 1 inning and had some elbow pain.
Okay.
And so they shut him down in hopes of preserving that arm. But it creates an interesting scenario because he's a free agent this year. And so he's probably not going to play till September.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for his offseason? Do they sign him? Do they not sign him?
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yes. So that is the world of sports. I don't know if you have anything else that you wanted to add on that.
The Aaron Rodgers saga
that's true.
is pretty interesting up in Green Bay right now.
Yeah, both sides seem pretty entrenched from what I can gather, right? Like the GM of the Packers is like, we are not trading Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah.
And Aaron Rodgers seems pretty adamant of, I don't want to play for you anymore.
Or he's told the organization, fire the GM.
Yeah.
And I think they have gone, we're not doing that. The other interesting thing in football, and I realize this isn't on our rundown and off topic, but is did you see I believe it's Shannon Sharp on arguing with Skip Bayless, right? Mm-hmm. Called Julio Jones and asked him,
Yes.
do you want to be traded? Do you want to leave Atlanta? And he's like, oh, heck yeah, I want to leave Atlanta. Yeah, I want to get out of here. This has been terrible.
Yeah.
And he goes, oh, by the way, you're on the air.
Yeah.
Now, in a sports media degree track at a university, is there an ethics course on what you do in media, and where does that land?
Yeah, my understanding is that that's basically like the first words out of your mouth after like, "Hey, good to hear from you, Julio. You're on the air."
Yeah,
like, that's sort of sports journalism 101. Even just sort of broadcast journalism 101, that you are required to let someone know you're on the air.
That was a wild situation.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all. That's football right now.
Yeah.
Drama.
And there's OTA stuff, but on the college football front, they just ended the recruiting dead period, meaning that
you could only recruit the dead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So starting back in March of last year, campus visits were prohibited as part of the recruiting process. So now with COVID on the major decline, they have starting June 1st today, college colleges are allowed to host prospective athletes officially on campus. I mean, athletes could come in unofficially, but there are all different sorts of rules for unofficial visits versus official visits. And there's movement in the NCAA towards name, image, and likeness legislation. Have you heard about this?
Yes. I know there's been some laws passed.
Yes. So I know this wasn't on the rundown either, but basically what's going on here is that there's a number of states now that have passed laws that allow college athletes in their state to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. Meaning that if you go to if you buy a jersey of your favorite Ohio State football player, before that athlete did not get a single dime from that sale. So if you went to a store and bought a Justin Fields jersey that even has his number and his name on the back of it, Justin Fields got zero for that jersey sale.
Which is ridiculous.
Which is absurd.
Yeah.
And so a number of states have passed individual legislation, which is beginning to cause some chaos because you've got these varying rules across the NCAA. But part of what is motivating this is to force the NCAA to come up with a policy that actually allows athletes to profit off of their name, image, or likeness.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But on to our main topic.
Yeah.
Not name, image, and likeness legislation.
No.
Something quite different.
Something quite different.
But something consistent with our various and sundry interests. What are we talking about today, John?
Evangelism.
Okay.
Yeah, evangelism. Doc, we talked about this topic. Gosh, when did we do our – we have regular meetings, probably quarterly, to determine topics. Why did we choose this one?
I think you chose it, didn't you?
Here's how these meetings go.
A little peek behind the curtain here.
Yeah. Is we come together and go, what are we going to talk about? And I throw out 10 to 15 ideas, and you pick the 7 best. Is usually how it goes, right? Right. I'm just like, well, we could talk about this. One of them was evangelism. Why did that stick for you?
Well, I think that it's one of those areas that is often neglected in the life of the Christian and the life of the church. And I think it's something that is only getting more challenging as our culture changes here in the U.S. in particular, that it's getting more difficult, I think, in some ways to share the gospel in more and more contexts.
Is that because of binary thinking, like either I am 100% on board with you or I disagree with you and hate you sort of thinking, or why is that?
Well, I think one of the – I think there's a couple things going on. There's cultural pressures and then there are political pressures, and obviously I think those often intertwine. But on the cultural front, obviously our culture is moving further and further away from a biblical sexual morality. And among many in our culture, anyone who does not embrace the new perspective on essentially anything is permissible in the sexual realm as long as there's consent. If you're not embracing that, you're immediately labeled as a bigot. And I think that has the effect of silencing or discouraging a number of believers from even raising the issue, because the instant you start talking about that kind of thing, you know it's coming that you're going to be labeled a bigot or intolerant or just so backwards. So I think that's the cultural pressure. I think the political pressure ends up being the fact that for a lot of people, when you start talking about being an evangelical, that is so associated with a certain set of political convictions that it becomes challenging, I think, to navigate through that. And so there are plenty of Christians, I think, that don't want to necessarily be confused with even, you're going to talk to me about Jesus. That means you must be one of these, hardcore Trump supporters who's buying into QAnon theories and have left all rationality behind kind of thing. So I think that's another sort of pressure that tends to silence Christians when it comes to the area of evangelism. Mm-hmm. In addition just to the normal sort of general cultural milieu that we live in, that talking about religion is tricky.
Taboo. Yeah.
And taboo and often not done in polite society, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And beyond that, it's just scary. It's
yeah.
I remember speaking with a pastor in New York City, and I was asking him, what's evangelism like here? Mm-hmm. And he looks at me and goes, it's really hard. And this was, this was when I was in seminary, so 2012. And he just said, and this always stuck with me, he goes, the gospel is offensive enough. I try to do everything I can to not be offensive.
Yeah.
In any other way. He's like, telling people that they're sinners and that they're going to hell is pretty offensive.
Yeah.
And so I try not to offend them in any other way.
Yeah, and I think also this is something that's been a reality for a little while now. But you think of like the track record of scandals among well-known TV evangelists that play into the charge of hypocrisy as well as all those people really want is my money. Mm-hmm. That's all they really want. So that plays into it as well.
Sure.
Where you're like, well, I don't want to be associated with that. Like, I just want to tell you about Jesus. Mm-hmm. But you think I'm part of this, sort of, more crazed fringe of things.
Yeah.
So I think those are all sorts of realities that we face today in terms of thinking about evangelism, let alone actually doing it.
Sure. And I think a response to a number of the things that you're saying is that Christians have really fenced themselves in at times in certain parts of the country into their own little communities. And I think that makes evangelism hard because you don't see people that don't believe the same things you do for the most part.
Right, which is, I think, just part of a larger cultural trend, which has been noted on the political and cultural front of people are more and more grouping together in essentially what become echo chambers.
Sure.
And so they're not interacting with people that disagree with them. They live in areas where almost everyone around them thinks the same, believes the same, and they even end up working in places where that's the case oftentimes. And so I think that can be an issue when it comes to the difficulty, where you don't even necessarily know what unbelievers really think. Mm-hmm. You might have ideas and caricatures based on portrayals in the media or social media, but do you know actual unbelievers and have had substantive enough conversations where you go, oh, okay, now I understand what you think.
Yeah.
I think that's becoming less and less common, that there's the Balkanization of our culture. You familiar with that term?
No. Oh, well, I think I understand what you're saying, but why don't you explain it for everybody else, and then I'll just sort of pick up and learn and say I agree with you at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
So that term came from probably originated maybe in the 90s when there's the part of Europe that used to be essentially Yugoslavia and other countries where countries in that area begin to break up along different ethnic groups and start to form their own little countries and stuff like that. And so that term Balkanization came to represent a population that was breaking down into smaller and smaller interest groups or ethnic groups or religious groups and forming these sort of protected fortress kind of mentalities rather than more broadly integrating within culture.
Interesting.
So I think that's happening, especially. I mean, today I think you hear the term tribalism a little bit more, which is kind of a similar idea of I just find who my people are and that's all I talk to and listen to and immerse myself in.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
all of which makes evangelism challenging.
Yes. Goodness, we've gotten off the rundown here a little bit.
What else is new?
Yeah. Goodness. I'm going to go further off the rundown here. I'm curious in your experience. You were with Cru for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And for those of you that don't know Cru, they're on major college campuses, a group of people that are support raisers that basically do evangelism and discipleship on campus.
Yep.
They also do weekly meetings and all sorts of things. They're in the dorms doing discipleship. Probably not this last year, but most years.
Yep.
And you did this for a number of years. Evangelism is a major component of this.
Yes.
And Cru does get some criticism for method and different things like that out there. And I'm curious, what was your experience like? Would you do it differently now? Would you do it the same now?
Yeah, I think that my own experience with Cru, now again, I was on staff. So I was a student from 91 to 95 and then on staff on a college campus until 2000. So basically the decade of the 90s, about 9 or 10 year stretch there. Mm-hmm. And at Ohio University, so a big public secular university. And even within the Midwest, on the more liberal side of even secular universities. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it was referred to as the Berkeley of the Midwest and that kind of thing. So very liberal. But so I was pretty regularly, especially when I was on staff, where I was doing evangelism on essentially a daily basis of some kind, meeting new students, sharing the gospel with them. And one of the primary tools that Campus Crusade, now known as Cru, is known for is the 4 spiritual laws, mm-hmm. A gospel tract that was created by Bill Bright, founder of of Cru, way back in the day, and it lays out a very simple gospel presentation. God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Man is sinful and has rebelled against God. Blanking on the spot here. The third one is Jesus Christ basically has paid the penalty for sins. Mm-hmm. And the fourth spiritual law then is this: you need to receive Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And so that's sort of the basic outline of a gospel presentation. And Cru was known for the 4 spiritual laws for decades. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was sort of like one of the leading gospel tools, gospel tracts that was used. And I think probably, I don't know, about halfway through my time with Cru, I became less enamored with using that particular tool. Not that I think it's inherently bad, but I felt like our culture had changed enough that the 4 spiritual laws worked in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s because there was still, in general terms, a broadly shared Judeo-Christian framework / worldview-ish. Mm-hmm. That when you said God, everybody pretty much assumed you meant the Christian God.
Sure.
And when you started talking through the different pieces of that, there was enough of those remnants where you could kind of assume that people understood what you meant when you said God, or you talked about Jesus or sin and those kinds of things. But by the time I was about halfway through my time with Cru, I just began to notice how much additional explaining I was having to do when I would say, God loves you. Who is this God? How do we, because everyone has their own sort of notions of what God's just like this kind grandpa figure who just loves everybody, doesn't care about sin. Like, no, that's not the case. So I began to have to do so much explanation that eventually I just sort of abandoned it. And started sharing the gospel a little bit differently, more in a conversational style. I had a diagram that I would use where I would just take a piece of paper and sort of draw out the gospel, starting in Genesis 1 in terms of God created human beings. And then I'd sort of lay out, here's a couple of key things you need to know about God. He's loving. He's just. I got to get that in there.
Yeah, those are important elements for sure.
And then he creates humanity, made in his image. What does that mean? Well, that means that we reflect him. It also means that we're accountable to him. Mm-hmm. And he's our judge, and so we're accountable. And so just sort of building the blocks out for that. And I found that to be a more engaging way to share the gospel rather than handing someone a booklet and say, can I read this to you?
Yeah.
That just felt very artificial. Mm-hmm. And I think even today it feels even more artificial. Now, I still think there's a place for tracts. Mm-hmm. I think they can be a helpful piece to leave with someone. Mm-hmm. I think they can have a place there. So those are some of the things that I began to change in terms of how I share the gospel. And even today, I would do it much more conversationally, and then perhaps leave a tract if depending on the context. If I'm going to have another follow-up conversation with that person, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably just I started doing more of the – if I could get someone where I thought I can meet with you again, I would say read John 1 or read like the first couple chapters of John. And then when we get back together, I'd love to hear your thoughts and talk about Jesus and sort of build through that rather than using tracts. Very cool.
I think taking a conversational approach is a great tip. Any other tips that you would bring along with you?
Well, I think that a lot depends on the context. Mm-hmm. If you're in a context where you're going to have an ongoing interaction with this person, you can afford to take a much more gradual and conversational approach.
Sure.
Where you're just trying to plant seeds, and maybe you're asking questions that you're hoping gets that person to think a little bit about some spiritual things or about realities that you can then press a little bit and be content with. Okay, we moved a little bit further on the process without feeling like I have to share the entirety of the gospel in this conversation.
Yeah.
But I will say there are contexts where that is not only appropriate but necessary. Mm-hmm. If you're in a context where you're having a gospel conversation with someone on an airplane, somewhere where you're like, we're never going to see each other again.
Yeah.
I think there is a wisdom to trying to be able to say, let me just share with you the basics of what the gospel is, just so that you understand where I'm coming from, and then give a very concise summary of the gospel message. And you just never know what God's going to do through that.
Yeah. I think I've found that necessary when I do travel and I'm in a coffee shop or something, and I'm reading my Bible or reading a book about Jesus, and somebody sees it and wants to strike up a conversation. We go there. You know.
Yeah.
I think I'm much more likely to take the conversational, long-term game with somebody and just sort of get to know them, invite them to church, have conversations with them, ask probing questions, see if they bite, and play a bit of the long game and see what happens over weeks, months, years, even.
Yep. My only caution in that is to make sure you still need to be intentional.
Yes.
That sometimes I've seen people who are saying they're doing that.
Yes.
But they're just hanging out with someone, and they're so concerned about putting any sort of strain on that new relationship that they're afraid to talk about Jesus or to ask any sort of like spiritual questions, or maybe it got shot down the first time you raised it. And so there still needs to be an intentionality there when you do that. I think the other thing that you mentioned in there that I would say is so important and might be the most to me it's certainly one of the most important things that I would tell people in regards to evangelism is ask questions.
Yeah.
Ask questions that get people to think about spiritual realities. Mm-hmm. And in particular, ask questions that can expose the flaws in their worldview, that make them realize, I thought this, but now that you ask that question, I realize that doesn't make good sense of my experience or the world around me. So so I think too often people can get so focused on, I got to have all the answers to tough questions that might get thrown at me, rather than thinking about what are some good questions that I can ask that get people thinking about spiritual things. And I think when you do that, it actually produces conversations rather than just straight presentations.
Yeah, and in any good friendship or any good conversation, the term going, that's a good question, I don't know the answer to that, is always acceptable.
Yes, and I would point out that from my experience with Cru, one of the things I learned over time was that while sometimes people have legitimate questions that are barriers to them coming to the point of saving faith, other times those are smoke screens. It's I don't necessarily want to talk about this, so what about evolution? Okay, so you give your little standard answer to that, and it's like, okay, well, what about the Bible? And they just keep throwing these bombs at you of like, well, what about this? What about this? And so one of the questions I learned to ask was, when I sensed this was happening, was to say, I'm willing to answer your questions. I'm not trying to deflect here, but let me ask you an important question first. If let's hypothetically say I'm able to satisfactorily answer all your questions about these things, will you commit your life to following Jesus at that point? And if the person says, I think I probably would, then you're like, okay, well let's go there. Let's go. Let's talk about these stumbling blocks that you're running into. But more often than not, the answer was probably not. Well, why is that? Let's talk about that.
That's far more interesting.
And 98 times out of 100, it was clearly it was one of those things where it's like, I realize that in order for me to follow Jesus, I have to give up this part of my life that I really value.
Yeah.
A relationship or some sort of sin or something that someone realizes. I say, well, that's the issue we got to talk about.
Yeah.
Like, all this other stuff is window dressing. This is important because that's what's keeping you from following Jesus. Let's talk about why you think that relationship is so important, or whatever that issue is that's keeping you from following Jesus.
Yeah. No, that's a good word. Anything else, Doc, before I push us on the resources?
I think there is a value in studying up on apologetics, having some basic answers to common questions that you get asked oftentimes. But don't think that you have to have those in place in order to faithfully share the gospel.
Yeah, apologetics is not evangelism.
It's not.
Yeah.
And it can be a great help and a great supplement.
Yep.
But the goal is to help people see the gospel clearly. And sometimes I think we can get so fired up about apologetics that we get more concerned about winning arguments than we are about actually leading people to see Jesus more clearly. So and oftentimes just having a basic understanding, a summary of the gospel in your head, and sharing how Jesus has changed your life. Those are great tools to have in place. And being willing to I'm glad I started doing this later in my Cru days. If you can get someone to agree to read the Bible with you, let the Bible do the work. It's God's word. It's inspired by the Spirit. Like, if you can get someone to agree, like, hey, let's meet next week for coffee, and in the meantime, why don't you read like the first couple chapters of John's Gospel, and we'll come back and we'll talk.
Yeah.
What are you seeing about Jesus? What's he doing? Who is he? Like, if you can start doing that, let God's word do God's work. Like, I think sometimes we undervalue the power of God's word in those kind of contexts.
Absolutely. Good word. Any potential resources that you would recommend?
Yep, got a few. The first one that I want to highlight is a book by my friend Randy Newman. Great guy. He wrote a book. He was on staff with Cru for goodness, at least probably 25 plus years. He wrote a book called Questioning Evangelism. Now, he's not, raising questions about evangelism.
Sure.
He's saying use questions to share the gospel. And so it just came out in a second edition. It's called Questioning Evangelism, Engaging People's Hearts the Way Jesus Did. And he even demonstrates how Jesus himself asked questions in the context of sharing the gospel. He wrote a second book entitled Corner Conversations that kind of gives some sample dialogues that are sort of based on his own experiences in doing evangelism. That could be super helpful as well. And then the other one on the more mechanics of it is Mark Dever's book, The Gospel and Personal Evangelism. Anything else? I've got a couple more down there, but
I read a book a couple years ago called Fool's Talk by Os Guinness, and it was recovering the art of Christian persuasion. And so it was how do we go about persuading individuals about the gospel, and I found that really helpful.
Yeah, well, it's getting away from us here in terms of time.
It is.
So we need to move on to athletes.
Yeah, let me blitz through them real quick. Bruce Matthews.
Are you familiar with him?
Nope.
Legendary offensive lineman for the Oilers. Yes, the Houston Oilers, the precursor to the Titans.
And he played for both teams, right?
Yes.
Did they switch over 98?
I forget what year that was,
okay.
But maybe earlier than that. But 14 Pro Bowls. And I can't remember how he's related. He's related to Clay Matthews. Clay Matthews is either his, I don't know if it's his son, but maybe a nephew.
Okay. Merlin Olsen?
Probably not familiar with him.
No, not at all.
Defensive tackle for the Rams in the 60s and 70s. Actually probably became more well-known for being a broadcaster and dabbled in acting. He was paired with Dick Enberg in the broadcast booth for years. Again, before your time.
Kenly Jansen. I know this one.
Okay. I didn't.
Okay. He's a closer for the Los Angeles Dodgers. Quite good on my fantasy team this year also.
Okay.
I will mention.
We've got two Ohio State athletes. John Hicks played offensive guard for the Buckeyes from 70 to 73, won the Lombardi Award, and was the runner-up for the Heisman Trophy. Not often you get an offensive lineman who finishes second, let alone wins it. So, and then Kirk Barton was an offensive tackle from 2003 to 2007, was on their national championship team during that window as well. I'm sorry. No, actually, he missed. He would have missed that national championship. I think he played in two national championship games and lost. But in any case, who do you like?
I'd probably go Bruce Matthews or Kenly Jansen would probably be my choices.
Okay. I'm going to go outside the box here and go with Kenly because we've been so offensive line heavy.
A pitcher feels nice.
A pitcher, So.
Yeah, he's getting up there in his career. He's had a good career.
Okay. One thing you liked?
Yeah. So this weekend, in the midst of yard work, I devoured the Athletics' new podcast called Shattered, Hope, Heartbreak, and the New York Knicks.
Okay.
So it begins with what were the 90s like for the Knicks? Okay, what was it like when James Dolan bought them in 1999? And then what happened in the next 20 years? Yeah. And it's fascinating. I mean, oh my goodness.
Probably a cathartic experience for you.
Oh my goodness. Really, it's about how did James Dolan ruin everything?
Okay.
And it's awesome.
Okay.
It comes out in there that he does not like computer passwords. And so he has MSG set up so that he never has to enter a password. And they've been hit with a few ransomware style things through the owner.
Yeah.
So his various houses in the Hamptons, Manhattan, all these areas, he doesn't have to enter a password from those IP addresses. And so guys go in and hack that IP address and break into MSG. Wild.
Yeah.
It's worth a listen.
Sometimes people who are that wealthy are surprisingly dumb.
Oh, James Dolan, they also had when the stuff was going down with Isaiah Thomas, He went in to give a deposition with zero prep. And they asked him just like, did you prepare for this? No, not at all.
That's quite an organization they're running there.
You need to go listen to it.
But I'm not a Knicks fan.
It doesn't matter. It does. The anthropology of James Dolan alone is fascinating.
Okay. All right. Well, my one thing I liked this week was I finished a book by Frederick Backman called A Man Called Ove. It was delightful. And he's a Swedish author, and the basic premise of the book is Ove is this crotchety old curmudgeon who is just – it's written very well in terms of describing a curmudgeon. And I'm not going to give too much away, but basically his wife dies, and he's just lost. He just doesn't know what to do with himself. And so he decides that he's going to kill himself. But every time he goes to try to kill himself, his younger neighbors around him like barge into his life and are in desperate need of some kind of help, like a trip to the hospital or to fix something. And he has such this sense of duty to help people, even as he's basically saying, "You guys are idiots." And so it's actually pretty heartwarming, the sort of transformation that happens in Ove's life. It's also been made into a movie in Sweden, so it has subtitles. But here in the U.S., they're actually going to make a version of it, and Tom Hanks is directing and I believe starring in it. It's in production now. So
Very cool.
A Man Called Ove. That's my one thing I liked this week. So we have talked sports. We've talked your beloved Knicks, the Mets, NBA playoffs. We've talked about evangelism, asking good questions in evangelism, and why it's necessary to do evangelism, why it's challenging to do it. We have mentioned several athletes that you've not heard of before, and then chosen the one that you have heard of.
Yep, that's right.
And we've talked about James Dolan's fascinating anthropology.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So I think you ready to call mission accomplished here?
I think so, yeah.
Just a reminder before we close the pod down, next week we will start our discussion of Jonathan Pennington's book, Jesus the Great Philosopher. So make sure you pick up a copy of that, read the first 3 chapters, and listen in. But with that said, I think we're at a point where all that is left to say is the Lord bless y'all real good.
Later.